As you read a good story, as you read a book, you'll notice if you try to see what's going on that every good story has a beginning, an introduction where you get to know the main characters as the course of the story is set. In the story that we're looking at, the life of Christ, that's the Christmas story. And then that story continues, the beginning continues with John the Baptist and the baptism of Jesus and his temptation. The story begins to build as the narrative goes on, and we've seen that in the Galilean ministry of Christ. And then often there comes a turning point, a point where the narrative shifts and where you're headed in one direction down one road, and all of a sudden things will take sometimes a dark turn. The story will then hit a peak, a climax. That's in our story, that peak is the week that Jesus Christ died, the cross and the resurrection, which we'll look at when I get back from Senegal. But today we're looking at the turning point of Jesus' ministry. We continue to walk Jesus' road to the cross. And our story today takes that dark turning point in his life and in his ministry. He had begun his Galilean ministry, and his fame was building, and the massive crowds were following him everywhere, listening to his teaching, seeking the miraculous blessings that he was passing out. Jesus' name was on every lip in Israel. They were wondering if he was the one, the Messiah, who would throw off the yoke of Roman oppression and make Israel great again. And then John tells us, as we looked last week, that Jesus started teaching hard truths, and people began to run away from Jesus as fast as they ran towards him. He was too demanding. His teachings were uncomfortable, and they didn't fit his preconceptions. They had this idea about who the Messiah would be, and Jesus wasn't fitting in with that. Opposition from the religious leaders began to boil up and began to boil over. And that's when Jesus took his disciples on a little retreat to a place called Caesarea Philippi. It's about 25 miles north of Capernaum, north of the Sea of Galilee. And it was an ancient pagan city, renamed not that long before Jesus' time for Herod's brother Philip. And it was nestled at the foothills of one of the tallest mountains in the area, Mount Hermon, I think they say. It was a center of pagan worship devoted to a god named Pan. Worship with wild worship. And it was always a pagan city, never a Jewish city. And there was this cave that you can see in this picture, a cave with a very deep spring, and water welled up out of that, and it was believed by many, the pagans, that they believed that this spring was a portal to the underworld, which they called Hades. Translated often in the New Testament hell, but Hades was the underworld, the place where the dead went and where underworld characters lived. These actually formed the headwaters, the beginning, the source of the River Jordan. It flowed down into the Sea of Galilee, and the Jordan flows out of the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea. But this is called the Grotto of Pan. And it's that dark cave, and there's the spring inside of that. And it's this weird place, and there's carvings, places carved out of the rock. And in ancient times, there were all these temples to the god Pan that were there. They've all been destroyed now. But among all these pagans, among these pagan temples, away from the crowds, they weren't following anymore, Jesus began to talk to his disciples and to begin to quiz them. And he asked them this. He said, "Who do people say that I am? What are people saying about me?" He wasn't insecure. He wasn't wondering. He wanted them to answer the question, and they began to pepper him with answers. They gave all these different answers. Some said, John the Baptist, risen from the dead. That was actually what Herod believed. He'd killed John and Now he believed that Jesus might be John come back from the dead. Some people said Elijah, who was supposed to be a forerunner of the Messiah. And others said Jeremiah or one of the prophets. They gave all of these answers. And then Jesus got to the heart of the matter. Who do you say that I am? What's your opinion? What have you come to believe? Now, I've made a lot of fun of Peter through the years because he was constantly sticking his foot in his mouth and saying the wrong thing. He was always the first to speak, and it usually wasn't a good thing. He usually said less than beneficial words. But here, he confessed Christ in the most glorious way. One of his best speeches in all of the Gospels, he said, "You are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God." They didn't always get things right, but this time, Peter could not have spoken better. And Jesus affirmed all of these words. He said, in fact, Peter, these words didn't even come from you. These were revealed to you by the Heavenly Father. And he addressed Peter with words that have been debated and argued for 2,000 years. And the beginning of this turning point, this was the beginning of the turning point. And it was the point where Jesus, who had been meandering around Galilee, all of a sudden, he took a straight road to Jerusalem, a straight road to the cross. And from here on out, his ministry was headed directly to the cross. This interaction in Caesarea Philippi was really the end of his time in Galilee, speaking to great crowds, doing he did miracles still, and crowds still followed him, but it was really the closing chapter of that great public ministry. And from this point on, Luke 9:51 says, Jesus set his face towards Jerusalem. The time had come. The time was now. It was time for Jesus to go, go, go. I don't know if any of you know Dr. Seuss, but that was a Dr. Seuss quote. The months of teaching and miracles and meandering through Galilee were drawing to a close, and the path before Jesus was a path that led straight to the cross and the empty tomb, the eternal purpose for which he'd come. Now, as we examine this passage, Matthew 16, verses 13 through 28, I don't know why in all these messages there's been 5 points. Baptist preachers are supposed to have 3 points. There's always been 5 points in almost all of these, 5 stories together. We're going to look at 5 great truths in Matthew 16, 13 through 28. And we're going to learn about the turning point in Jesus' ministry. The first truth is that Jesus would build a hell-defeating church. Look at verse 18. Now, we've already kind of looked at the early verses of this passage, but look what he says here. Now, these inspiring words that he spoke to Simon have been debated for 2,000 years. He said, I say to you that you are Petros. Petros. It means rock. That's how he'd say it in Greek, although he was probably speaking Aramaic. And upon this rock, Petra, I will build my church, and the gates of hell, or the powers of hell, will not conquer it. Jesus calls Simon, his disciple's name was Simon, but Jesus gave him a nickname. It was Peter, the rock. And he says that on the rock he will build his church. Now, some churches have taken Peter as the rock on which Jesus would build the church. Others have tried to say that the rock, since it's he said, you're Petros, and on this Petra I will build my church. They said it's a slightly different word. It must be Peter's confession of Christ, or all of the apostles, or something else. But it's pretty clear here from the context, and when you take the original Aramaic language they were speaking into account, Jesus is speaking to Peter, and he's saying, Peter, you're the rock on which the church would be built. And it's a historical fact. In the early chapters of Acts, Peter was the key leader of the church. He was the foundation. And even in the epistles, especially in Ephesians, I think in 1 Corinthians as well, Jesus says, I am the cornerstone of the church, and the apostles are the foundation, and then on that we build, the authority of the apostles and the teaching of the apostles, which is the Word of God. Jesus is the cornerstone, the Word of God, and the authority of the apostles was the foundation, and then Jesus Christ builds on that. But that's not an important point in this message today. I know it sounds strange for me to take time to make a point and then say it's not important, but the key here is not the identity of the rock, but the fact that Jesus says, I'm going to build a church, and the gates of hell can't stand against the church that I'm going to build. I'm going to build a church, and hell cannot stand against the church that I will build. I'm going to build a church, and by the way, hell here is the word Hades, the place of death, the pagan underworld. Jesus was claiming that he would build a church, a gathering of believers that could stand strong against all the power of death and sin and darkness and all the pagan forces of evil in this world. And I am convinced that the modern American church simply does not believe this. We do not believe that the church has the power to stand against the forces of darkness. Oh yeah, we believe it when the preacher preaches it. We believe it in our minds. But when we're faced with the power of darkness in this world, when we're faced with evil men doing evil things, we crumble and we fall apart, and we assume that the church has no power to stand against politicians doing bad things, against people like Putin doing evil things, and we crumble and we fall apart, and we act like Jesus must have been lying when he said, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades cannot stand against it. The forces of darkness, the liberals, the fill in the blanks, however you want to fill them in, are so strong we're helpless against them. And I think there's a reason for that. I think for the most part, we have built the church ourselves on human ability, human reason, and we've built a pretty flimsy excuse instead of the church of Jesus Christ. Now, I wish I had time, and I probably should take time, to explain the difference between a Christ-built church and a human-built church. A Christ-built church is built on the sound teaching of the Word of God, on obedience to Christ, on the way of the cross, which we're going to talk about today. A human-built church is built on a man, on his charisma and ability and power. It's built on organization and manipulation and power and structure and all of those things. It's built on entertainment and a lot of other things. And by the way, I don't think this is just a new versus old thing. I think this has been happening for a long time. In fact, as we study history, it's been happening for most of the 2,000 years of the church. The gates of hell are not threatened by human-built, human-powered churches. They can overcome those in a snap. It is the church of Jesus Christ, built on the foundation of the truth of God's Word and the power of the Holy Spirit, that can stand against the darkness of the pagan world. Our fleshly dependence on human ability, human leadership, human ideas is seeking to build the church. It's a form of ecclesiological, that's just a big word for church. It's suicide. Because the church that Jesus builds is not threatened by the power of darkness, but Satan doesn't worry about human ability and human power. The power of evil comes against the human-built church and tears it apart with division, tears it apart with false ideas, with false doctrine, but he cannot stand against the Jesus-built church. There's an interesting thought here that was shared with us on my first trip to Israel. This again is the Grotto of Pan, that cave with the deep well that was believed to be a portal to Hades, a portal to the underworld. And they said that it was even called, and I haven't been able to check this out with full surety, but our leader said that this was called, in ancient days, the gates of Hades. In this worship that it was called, and Jesus was standing there somewhere in this center of pagan worship with this deep well that was believed to be a gate to the underworld, a gate to Hades. And he said, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades can't stand against what I'm doing. Where the water sprang from the depths of the underworld, where a city was devoted to the worship of pagan deities, he asserted that evil can never stand. He was saying that Jesus, he said, I am victorious over death. I am victorious over hell, over all the powers of darkness, and you better believe it. That's why we have to focus everything on Jesus. Christ builds his church, and hell flees. Christ builds his church, and hell flees. The church has looked dead so many times, but when Christ builds it, hell flees. And we need to let him build his church, and I need to move on. Second truth. The foundation of a hell-defeating church is the cross and the resurrection. It was just after this confession of Peter and Jesus' bold prediction of a hell-defeating church that Jesus began to break the disciples' hearts. Look at this passage. From then on, Jesus began to tell his disciples plainly that it was necessary for him to go to Jerusalem and that he would suffer many terrible things at the hands of the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of religious law. He would be killed, and on the third day, he would be raised from the dead. Now, this was all new to them. He says he began to teach them this. The disciples were swallowing hard. They weren't getting it. They'd always thought, this is the key to understanding the disciples, they'd assumed they were going to be the cabinet, the holders of power in Jesus' earthly kingdom. When Jesus kicked out the Romans and took political power in Israel, they were going to be his right-hand men. They were going to have all the power and glory. And now he's talking about dying. Now, the part about the resurrection, they never heard that part. They only heard the part about dying. The one they'd given their lives for was talking about dying. And they couldn't grasp that it was the heart of Jesus work, that it was his eternal purpose, that he'd come to earth to die. And the church of Jesus Christ was going to be built on this cornerstone. Jesus would die for the sins of the world, and he would rise again to bring forgiveness to everyone who would believe, salvation to the world, and new life to everyone who would repent of their sins and believe on him. He humbled himself, and he walked the way of the cross. The Father then exalted him to the highest place, gave him the name that is above every name, and everything is built on this truth. The key is, there is no hell-defeating church without the cross and the resurrection. We do not defeat hell without Jesus dying and rising from the dead. You understand that? I'm not going to belabor that. I belabored the first point. I just want you to understand that. And then we move on to the second point, or the third point. Satan tempts us to bypass the way of the cross, to walk on the paths of glory, of earthly glory. Now, this is ironic. if you will, a real plot twist. Peter's moment of earthly glory didn't last long. In verse 22, he had this glory. God revealed this to you. You said the right thing, Peter, and then all of a sudden he's back to sticking his foot in his mouth. And we talked about this 2 or 3 weeks ago. But Peter called, this is hilarious. He's just said, you are the Son of God, the Messiah, and now he calls Jesus to the side. I can just see him putting his arm around Jesus and saying, look, this is not going well, Jesus. Lord, this is, you got to stop this talk about dying. It's not cool at all. He took him aside and he reprimanded the Son of God. What hubris. He reprimanded the Son of God. Heaven forbid, Lord, this will never happen to you. That's a plot twist. He just confessed that Jesus was the Son of God. Now he's pulling him aside and correcting him. Look, stop talking, Jesus. His mind was boggled at the idea of Jesus dying because his mind was filled with visions of grandeur, of glory. He'd hitched his wagon to a star and he was going to win. He was going to defeat the Romans and he was going to be Jesus' right-hand man. And this idea of suffering and dying, laying down his life, it was not part of the plan. He wasn't, he was on a path of glory, the way of glory. And Jesus was talking about the way of the cross. And Jesus rebuked him. And it seems harsh until you understand what he's saying. Jesus said, "Get away from me, Satan." Yikes. You are a dangerous trap to me. You're looking at things from a human point of view, not from God's point of view. Now look, after just calling Peter, this is another plot twist. After just calling Peter the rock upon which the church would be built, he now says, "You're Satan." Has he changed his mind? He said, "You're the rock. Now you're a dangerous trap." No, Jesus hasn't changed his mind. He's trying to explain something to Peter. He was still the rock, the primary foundation upon which the early church would be built. Nothing has changed. What he's warning him about is the constant danger that would always come to the church. Satan is always tempting the church to turn away from the way of the cross and to walk the way of glory. Be great. Talk about how great you are. Talk about how people can be great. Satan will always tempt us to build the church on human wisdom, human effort, human ways, the way of glory. We want to triumph. We want to win, to get ahead, to gain power, to gain wealth, to gain the things of this world. Satan started it. Satan said, "I will ascend to the heavens and I will become like the Most High God." That's the path of glory. I will ascend. I will become like God. I will reach up and grab. What did he say to Adam and Eve in the garden? If you'll just eat the fruit, you will either become like God or become like gods. It can be translated either way, and it's about the same thing. Go for all the gusto. Get your best life now. And Satan is always tempting us, individually and as churches, to go for our best now. To pride, to winning, to human achievement, to ambition, rather than the way of the cross. He always whispers to us individually and as a church to take that road. And Jesus told us in no uncertain terms, that's not the road. He called the rock of the whole church. He said, "You're acting like Satan now." The church is never more like Satan than when it's seeking earthly glory, when it's following earthly ambition. Jesus had a different way. He called his people to follow him to the cross. This is much like Luke 9:23. He says, He called out the way of glory, the way of human triumph and glory. And he doubled down and made it clear that he was, listen here, folks. He said, I'm not the only one headed to the cross. I just told you I was going to the cross. But he's saying in verses 24 and 25, he said, I'm not the only one going to the cross. Look at these verses. If any one of you wants to follow after me, you must give up your own way. And that is absolutely emphatic in the Greek. You must deny yourself. You've got to give up your own way. And you've got to take up your cross. What did you do when you took up a cross? You died. And you follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you lose it. And if you give up your life for my sake, you save it. And the implication is for all of eternity. Following Jesus was not a path to riches. It's not a path to fame, to power, to your best life now. Only lying liars who lie say that. Following Jesus means holding Jesus' hand as he walks down the Via Dolorosa, the path of suffering, the road to Calvary. The command to deny yourself, as I said, it's emphatic. Completely and totally deny yourself. There's nothing less Christian, less Christ-like than selfishness, than a self-centered life. And instead of the path of self, the path of glory, we choose the road to the cross and we follow Christ on that road. It's a daily journey. It's something you do once when you put your faith in Jesus Christ. You choose to deny yourself and take up your cross and follow Jesus. You give yourself to him completely and totally. And then it's a daily act of self-denial. And I just challenge you to search the scriptures and find any kind of Christianity offered that doesn't involve being crucified with Christ, dying to self, denying yourself, and living for the kingdom of God. We have offered that kind of Christianity throughout our country, and we're bearing the fruit of that. We are called to the way of the cross, and it is consistently, in this passage and others, it is Satan's lie that we can walk the path of glory and still walk with Christ. Christ calls us to the way of the cross. To gain the life of God, we give up our lives, and there is no other faith offered in Scripture. The words of verse 25 are absolutely 100% clear. There are few Christians who ever obey this verse. I mean, to really give ourselves up, to lay ourselves on the line for Christ. But this is the only Christianity presented in the Bible. Now, the fifth truth brings all of this together, wraps it all up in a bow. The rewards of the way of the cross are eternal. There may be a question brewing in your mind as I've said this. Is the Christian life nothing but suffering and sacrifice and hardship? Are there no rewards, no joys, no victories in the Christian life? Please hear what I'm about to say. Is it worth it to serve Jesus? Absolutely. Are there rewards? There are rewards. Look at what verse 20, well, I'm not getting there yet. Here's the biblical truth. God promises us that every suffering you ever suffer, every sacrifice you ever make, every service you ever render in the name of Jesus Christ, genuinely render, will be rewarded. The problem is, we have developed a Christianity that says all those rewards will come immediately or in this world. And the fact of the matter is, our God is so good that he floods our lives with blessing. He gives us good things. He's a good father. I remember one of the great blessings I ever received was in a real time of spiritual coldness in my own life. And I'm like, man, God just shouldn't be this good to me when I'm just not really passionate about him. But he's just a good father. But the fact of the matter is, the promises of the Bible about rewards and blessings all focus on our treasures in heaven. Jesus said, store up treasures in heaven. The Bible constantly talks about crowns. Now, don't get the idea that you're going to have all these like big, heavy gold crowns. Have you ever watched the Boston Marathon? And at the end, they give the winners these laurel wreaths. They're victor's crowns. And that's the kind of crowns that are talked about there. They're crowns for running your race well. We're not going to walk around heaven, trying to balance these huge crowns on our heads. They're rewards, and I don't know that they're actually physical crowns on our head. It's a symbol of being rewarded somehow, and I don't really know what it all means. But the fact of the matter is, our rewards are stored up in heaven. Now look at verse 27. Verse 27 says, "For the Son of Man will come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and will judge all people according to his deeds." Now, for some people, that is horrific, because their deeds will be judged, and they will be found not to have had their names written in the book of life, and they will be separated from God for all eternity. And that's horrible. That's the most horrible thing that can happen to anybody. But there is a thing throughout Scripture in the New Testament called the judgment seat of Christ, where believers will be brought and we will be given rewards for our service to him. And I don't understand it. Please don't ask me after the service, what exactly are the rewards? I'll tell you the answer I'll give you right now. I don't know. They're worth getting, and you don't want to lose them, but I don't know what they are. They're real. But you will be rewarded for your service. You'll be comforted for your suffering. It's worth it to serve Jesus. I want to show you a couple of my favorite verses. I love Romans 8:18. What we suffer now is nothing compared to the glory he will reveal to us when? Later. And it's very clear in that passage, when you read the rest of that passage, that the later is not like next week. It's in glory. Do you remember in 1 Corinthians 15 when he said, if there is no resurrection, we are of all men most miserable? Why is that? Because all the rewards for living in Christ, Paul was sacrificing, he was suffering, and he eventually lost his head over his faith. Literally. And he said, I am giving it all up now. I gave up everything for Jesus. And if I die and there's no Jesus, why didn't I just go to the beach and drink lemonade and get a tan? Why? Listen, if you are not living a life in such a way that if there is no resurrection, you've wasted your life completely, then you're not living out the Christian faith. You and I ought to be living life such that if we die and there is no resurrection, we have completely and totally wasted everything. We are gamblers. I bet you never heard a Baptist preacher say that, did you? We gamble everything on the fact that when we close our eyes in this world, we open them to a Jesus Christ who says, well done, good and faithful servant. And if we're not doing that, we're wasting our time and our breath and our labors here. That's what it's all about. If we suffer, we say, okay, but when I close my eyes for the last time, I see Jesus and it's worth it. I love this one. I think it's in the NIV, it says, our light and momentary afflictions. I'm not sure what translates, but I like that one. Our present troubles are small and they don't last long. Have you ever read 2 Corinthians 11? I guarantee you, if you had Paul's troubles, you would not call them light or momentary. Dude suffered. See how cool I am? I use the word dude. I am a hipster, let's face it. Y'all are thinking bad things about me. But he called compared to the glory, the weight of glory that was coming, he said, this is just light. Read 2 Corinthians 11 and how much he suffered. He said, this is no big deal compared to what's waiting for me in heaven. And he was just gambling everything. I should probably stop saying gambling, shouldn't I? But he had just put everything onto the fact that on the other side was Jesus waiting to reward him for all that he'd suffered, all that he'd sacrificed, all of his hardships. And that will last forever. So he said, it will be worth it all. It will be worth it all. So there's 3 questions today as we wrap this up. Do you believe in a God who eternally rewards those who seek him and serve him? You don't have to nod. In fact, why don't you bow your heads and talk to God? Do you really believe in a God who's waiting for you on the other side, who's with you every day in this life? If you haven't trusted Christ, then you need to do that right now. You need to put your faith in Christ, turn from your sin and say, Father, I trust you with all my heart, because you need what he gives you. But do you believe in a God who eternally rewards those who seek him and serve him, even at the point of suffering, even at the point of sacrifice? Do you, second question, do you believe that enough to reject the way of glory and walk the way of the cross with Jesus Christ? Do you believe it enough to really put your life on the line like Paul did? And so the last question today, will you? Maybe someone here for the first time. All of us today. Will you commit yourself to the way of the cross? You need to do this every day. This is not I'm going to do it one Sunday, because I guarantee you the flesh will fight back tomorrow. And Satan will be throwing little way of the glory tracts in your way tomorrow. He passes out those tracts all the time. Go the way of glory. Will you today commit? I'm going to deny myself and take up your cross, and I'm going to follow you, Jesus. Father in heaven, preparing this and preaching this has been such a struggle for me, because in my own life, I'm struggling with some of these issues and decisions between what I want to do and what you want me to do. And Lord, I just pray, and I lay my life in front of these people down, and I say, I'll go where you want me to go. I'll do what you want me to do. I'll be what you want me to be, no matter how hard it is. And I pray, Lord, that you would cause each one of us here today to say exactly that same thing. We will go where you want us to go, do what you want us to do, say what you want us to say, and be who you want us to be. We'll walk the way of the cross and reject the way of glory. In Jesus' wonderful name, amen.